much weight should you use to build your butt?
Don't you want to look good naked?
So the first thing we need to discuss when we're talking about the amount of weight you should be using to build your glutes, or any muscle for that matter, is thinking about using enough weight to create enough tension, but also continuing to add on to that as you progress. And what I mean by that is that our body is very good at adapting to whatever we throw at it. So if we're not continuing to progress forward with movements that we're choosing, especially when we're trying to build muscle, that can cause us to basically plateau or just stay stagnant. So we need to continue to create the stimulus in order that basically the stimulus that is sent to our body that says, hey, continue to grow. And in order for that to happen, it's either going to be adding more load or adding more reps or more sets or more time under tension, things like that. Those are all part of what we call progressive overload. So coming back to the load side of things or the weight side of things, when you're trying to build your glutes, you want to make sure you're using enough load or enough weight to create enough tension to be able to adapt to or to create that stimulus and then grow, and then create more of that tension and then grow. And so really what we're talking about there is making sure that you're incorporating movements where you can actually what we call loadability. They have loadability to them. You're able to continue to load them. So movements like hip thrusts, squats, leg presses, split squats, all of these movements are great for growing your glutes, but you have to make sure that you're using enough weight in order to send that signal to your body that says, hey, keep growing. This is new weight. I need to be able to adapt to this next time. So that's where that growth comes from. It's all relative, right? Everybody is starting at different places. So a weight that's heavy enough for one person might be too light for the other, or vice versa. So really just thinking about, okay, am I progressing with this weight? Am I adding weight over time? Not necessarily like every single session you have to add weight to the movement, but over time, when you look, a few months from now and you're looking at your logbook, which you should have a logbook if you're training, because it's super important to track all your weights and reps and things like that so that you actually know that you're progressing. So when you look back at your logbook over time, you want to see that you're progressing. Piggybacking off the last point, in order to add enough load, we have to, again, pick movements that we can load up, or movements that have a lot of loadability. So picking movements that are, for your glutes specifically, that are going to be barbell movements, machine movements, over booty band movements, or resistance band movements. And the reason for that is because if you just think about it practically, you can continue to add weight and load to the barbell versus resistance bands. There's only so much you can do with those. So another thing to think about besides just the amount of weight you're using is really focusing on the form and setup of the movement that you're executing, right? So if you, for example, if you take a barbell hip thrust, and you're adding weight to it, and you continue to add weight, and you're like, okay, I just need to keep adding more plates and more plates, but that comes at the cost of other muscles starting to take over versus your glutes, or you're not getting full hip extension at the top, which happens if you're, letting your ego take over and you're putting lots of plates on the bar, but you're not actually getting that full contraction at the top. That's going to take away from creating as much tension within your glutes as possible. So this really comes down to, finding that balance between enough load so that you can perform the movement and create as much tension as possible, but not too much load that you're basically letting your ego take over and you're not executing it properly anymore. You're not spending time where it's hardest. Aside from adding load to the bar or to the machine, you want to make sure that you're focused on creating enough tension in the glutes and also proper setup. So that's going to come from setting up the movement properly, executing the movement properly, and really spending time where it's hard. So if we're talking about glute exercises, and really any exercises, I like to divide them into what we call stretchers and squeezers. So the stretchers are the movements that typically are hardest in that stretched position. So if we're thinking about glutes, those are going to be your RDLs, the bottom of a leg press, for example, the bottom of a squat. The squeezers are going to be the ones that are hardest in that shortened or contracted position. So thinking at the top of a glute bridge or the top of a hip thrust, or the squeeze at the back of a back extension, or the squeeze at the back of the kickback. Those are all going to be that that squeezed, contracted position. And so when I say spend time where it's hard with those movements, you have to know like, okay, where's the hardest part of the movement, which with the stretchers is gonna be more in that stretched position, and the squeezers are gonna be more in that contracted position. So for example, if you're doing a hip thrust and you're adding, or you're doing a glute bridge and you're adding tons of weight to the bar, but you can't get into that fully shortened or contracted position at the top where your hips are in full hip extension, if you can't get there because the load's too heavy, you're selling yourself short really. And you're doing a lot of work, but not getting what you want out of it, right? If your goal is to build your glutes and create as much tension in your glutes, you need to spend time where it's hard. Another example with the stretcher type movement, so for example, an RDL, if you're adding tons of load to the bar, whether you're using a barbell or a trap bar, and you're not able to keep the tension within your glutes, so maybe your lower back's taking over at the bottom, if you're not able to spend a little bit of time at the bottom without feeling like your lower back's taking over, that's probably a sign that the weight is too heavy. So again, we wanna make sure that we're paying attention to what are we doing this exercise for, where are we trying to, what muscle are we trying to target, and not allowing other muscles to kind of come into the mix, right? Obviously that's gonna happen, especially with more compound movements. Other muscles are gonna be working, they're gonna be stabilizing, but if your primary goal, for example, is to focus on your glutes, if you add too much weight to that, other muscles are gonna start taking over if your glutes are not able to create as much force there. So to wrap it all up, in terms of how much weight you should be using to build your glutes, enough weight that you can create enough tension within that muscle tissue to grow and to be able to adapt and progress, but not too much where you're letting your ego take over and your form's breaking down, your technique's breaking down, other muscles are coming into the picture. So those are a few things to think about when you're thinking about loading up movements for your glutes.
Women, we believe